Hey, we're live.
Hello.
Understand what's going on around you. You are in a state of war, and you have precious little time to save yourself. It's a slow process, which we call active measures. What matters is essentials: economy, foreign relations, defense systems. With a violent change of power, structure, and economy, a period of normalization. This is what will happen in the United States if you allow all the schmucks to put a big brother government in Washington, D.C., who will promise lots of things, never mind whether the promises are fulfilled or not.
And welcome to the Blindside podcast, which is Dario's idea for the new name of the podcast. We were messing around. This is still an experimental mode. I'm Isabella Kaminska, the editor-founder of The Blind Spot, and I'm joined as usual by Dario Garcia Guinea, who is my trusty ally and sidekick. And this is the ongoing experiment that is our podcast, which we've hijacked from the previous podcast, which I was doing with Junseth, who doesn't still know about me hijacking the channel. So shh, don't tell anybody. We're experimenting today with a live show, so forgive us for any mistakes, etc. Dario, do you think this is going to work as a title?
The jury's out there.
Okay, I think it's a bit of a tongue twister myself, but do give us feedback on what you think. The purpose of this podcast, as we explained earlier, was to essentially highlight the great work we're doing on the Blind Spot newsletter, which is a paid walled product. But we wanted to get some reach, and we thought this would be a good way to do it. So we essentially review what the newsletter came out with the week before on a Friday, and preview a little bit of the newsletter that's coming out. Usually it's supposed to come out on a Saturday morning. Of course, I am incredibly inconsistent with that due to my insanely busy schedule. So last week it came out on a Sunday, unfortunately, but hopefully today we will get it done for Saturday. So why did we start with that clip, Dario? Do you know
Why
what it
did
was
we start
from?
with that?
Yeah.
It was from Yuri somethings, right?
Yuri Bezimov. So the reason I brought it up is because I was reading a great piece by Ayaan Hirsi, who is Neil Ferguson's wife, on Barry Weiss's Free Press. She'd done a big piece about subversion, and I was quite impressed to see that she had referenced Yuri Bezimov in her column about why she has decided to become a Christian and how she feels that Western values are under attack, etc., etc. And I just thought it was interesting because Yuri Bezimov has been on my radar for a while, maybe because I'm Polish. So I kind of thought everyone knew about it, but it was very interesting that when I shared that with a few people, they had not yet heard of Yuri Bezimov. So I thought it was a good and worthy clip to put out, since some of the topics we will be looking at this week relate to sort of disinformation and whether there is or isn't a sort of wider hybrid war going on. But where should we start? Because in theory, we should, as this is still in experimental mode, we should stick to the schedule and be as thorough as possible and as quick. The idea is we do this within 40 minutes, so it's a bit of a challenge. We started last week's newsletter looking at the other story. Obviously, last week, everyone was focused on Trump and the Trump arrest. That's usually a signal something else is getting buried. And at the time, the story I felt was being buried a little bit was the fact that Biden had okayed the use of NATO weapons by the Ukrainians in Russia. And I don't know, Dario, tell me if you disagree, but I feel like this was largely ignored. I mean, not it was obviously noted in the right circles, but I think it was largely ignored by the mainstream, because the Trump fiasco was going on, but also because there is a perception, I think, that the Ukrainians are already active in Russia and on Russian territory, and that they've been sabotaging stuff, and that the idea of whether a weapon originates, where it originates, and does it really make a difference if they're already active in that space? And of course, the big difference here is that and you are my weapons expert, right? I don't know anything about weapons, but the difference here is the type of weapons they are going to be using, and these are long-range missiles. And Putin's point, so Putin came out with a statement at the same time. His point is that actually for these weapons to work, there's just no way you can do it without NATO reconnaissance and satellites. And therefore, it's not the Ukrainians programming these weapons. They have to depend on NATO resources to do so. And even potentially the coordinates are not coming from the Ukrainians. They're coming from the US. So does that mean active NATO participation? What's your take as the resident weapons expert?
So it's true that while people assume that Ukraine was already striking inside of Russia, this was done with really severe limitations imposed by NATO. Notably, there was a big outcry after Ukraine targeted Russian oil refineries, which is a bit of a no-go because of how much damage that does to international energy markets. But I mean, the thing with NATO missiles is that, yes, Putin really has a point that it does take NATO programming, or at least space-based reconnaissance, as we write about it in the newsletter, in order to target the Russian areas. But I can't help but think that this is NATO's way of essentially bending over for Ukraine with the Ukrainian threat of striking Russian refineries. And what NATO's offering in exchange is, look, we'll help you hit with pinpoint accuracy military targets so that you don't have to go for Russian oil refineries. I think that's a bit the trade-off that we're seeing here. And obviously hitting military targets is a lot less consequential than hitting Russia's oil refineries because they have so few of them. But the last thing I would say is that while these long-range missiles were a really big deal at the start of the conflict, the actual percentage in accuracy that these missiles are having is really dropping significantly, even for things like British Storm Shadow missiles, but especially for ATACMS, I forget what these initials stand for. The accuracy and number of targets successfully targeted is really dropping like a rock because the Russians are adapting with really good jamming.
So it's all about the jamming.
It's all about jamming.
And so does that mean a live missile gets lost on its way to the target, essentially, or it gets misdirected somewhere else? Or
exactly it just gets fuzzled.
I see. So they can.
So this doesn't mean what it would have meant 3 years ago, is my point.
So would you say that Putin is exaggerating then the NATO involvement?
No, the point that's really interesting is exactly what he's coming to, which is direct NATO involvement. Not so much, I would say the threat is not so much in the actual damage that these missiles can do, particularly because NATO won't have an interest in super escalating the conflict. But as a matter of fact, involving NATO on decisions deep inside Russian sovereign territory, together with news that France, for example, saw no problem with training troops in Ukrainian territory. I think that's at the heart of Russian concerns, which is that if NATO is escalating and taking this one step forward, how will Russia respond?
I see. This is a good moment to get you to preview what you're working on regarding the Red Sea, because you're doing an update. Everyone else is thinking about other things at the moment. There's the European elections going on. We've had the ECB cut rates for the first time since 2019. We've had obviously D-Day, reform, Nigel Farage is about so many things distracting the world from from other, and obviously Israel, ongoing tensions in Israel and Gaza. So tell us what's the latest on the Red Sea.
So without wanting to spoil the excellent content we've got ready, basically Russia has finally signed for a base in the port of Sudan, which is in the northeastern region of Sudan under the control of the Sudanese armed forces. And the interesting bit, as I explained in the newsletter, is that this represents a shift in backing from Russia, who for years had been reported as financially backing the rapid support forces of Hemeti, who's based in Sudan's south, and of who granted gold refineries to the Wagner Group back in its heyday. So this represents a significant shift, at least in the public sphere. At least I wasn't aware that Russia had effectively started to balance its bets in the Sudanese civil war. And this is a Russian logistical military port that can fit 300 military personnel and 4 ships and an unlimited number of commercial vessels, which may be used for nuclear submarines in the future. And that's as much as I'll say, so that people actually want to read it.
I think that's a good moment to move on to why we have images of Carthage all over. Well, Carthage, you've got Carthage. I've got like Toza, aka Tatooine, which is in Tunisia. The actual place they filmed it was in Toza, and then the behind the scenes is an image I took when I popped over to Tunisia over half term this past half term. Had the opportunity to go there, and it was fascinating. I'd not really been following what's going on in Tunisia. Tunisia, for those who don't know, was the first spark in the Arab Spring revolutions. The so-called Jasmine Revolution started there in January 2011, and it was considered for a long time to be the most successful one in the region because they did overthrow Ben Ali, the dictator at the time, and brought in a democracy. But from being on the ground there, it was very interesting to hear their views, or at least some pocketed views, about how democracy has served them. And again, there is ongoing a little bit of disillusionment because it turned out that democracy was a sort of, well, it was described as a Trojan horse to me, which allowed radical extremist Muslim parties to come to power, notably the Muslim Brotherhood, and this in Tunisia, it is a very secular country and for a Muslim state, and they saw it as sort of regressive because rather than focusing on the great economic projects that were like being planned to help greenify the desert there and bring water, and there were really grand plans. Well, not so much under Ben Ali. Apparently Ben Ali was incredibly corrupt, and that was a true fact, but there were moments where it was looking good that maybe these grandiose projects could be materialized. But the debate turned more into one about whether Tunisia should be a secular or Islamic state, which distracted a lot of the political bandwidth and the people's time, really. And so in the process, whilst there has been a few, the government apparently is trying to push ahead with some of these projects, it has been distracted, and there were other cases of extreme, I believe there were a few terror attacks on tourists. They've never really recovered tourist-wise, so 50% of the country, I would say, like, tourism is down about 50%. They told me, and yeah, it is a fantastic country, like in terms of the resources and the beaches, and for tourists, it is equivalent to Morocco, if not better. And I think the main perception I got was one of a stifled economy. They have capital controls, very strict import-export taxes, and also foreign exchange controls, which makes it very hard for tourists because any exchange, like even paying your driver, or you have to have the local currency, or you have to deal in cash dollars, which there is a bit of an underground black market. But also interestingly, the current government, and I'm not I'm not even going to try and pronounce the president's name. His palace overlooks the ruins of olden day Carthage, of ancient Carthage. He's now being accused of anti-democratic and sort of repressive practices and repressing the media in particular. And you know, it seems an ongoing bad cycle, essentially. So when I spoke to the different, depending who you spoke, I mean, some people actually appreciate that. Some people appreciate that he has to be dictatorial to suppress some of the worst elements, and that he wasn't too experienced and he's making these mistakes. But so there is this weird sort of appreciation for dictatorship. Naturally, obviously, they're Carthaginians. They are incredibly well versed on their history. They, you know, then nobody has to be schooled in Roman history over there. So they see it as fairly, you know, par for the course that like democracies will fail and that strong men will come out of democratic chaos. I found it a very interesting time, and at the week I was there happened to coincide with Mark Zuckerberg's 40th, where he wore a T-shirt in one of his he had some photography done of his I think his wife set some backdrops from his student times, and there was a picture of him with Bill Gates, and in it he was wearing a Carthago delenda T-shirt, and apparently this went viral in Tunisia because it was seen like there was a massive conspiracy theory that this was like a secret signal that Mark Zuckerberg was coming for Carthage because Carthage will be destroyed because of the disappointment with the current leader, and that the democracy that had, you know, been injected into the country was failing, so it was ripe for another color revolution. So that was the conspiracy on the ground, but certainly one to watch. And you know, you forget how close Tunisia is to Libya, and we were traveling around. We got to see the signs going into Tripoli, and there's black market. You can see black market oil everywhere. So there's also all the trade that comes from Libya across the border. And the last point I will say about Tunisia is, again, depends who you speak to, but there was a lot of reluctance and resistance against immigration into their own country. So there is a sort of similar kind of reform, Nigel Farage mentality within Tunisia itself against immigration from other African countries that is coming into Tunisia, even though a lot of it is just as a waiting ground to get into Europe. There seems to be some discontent about it as well domestically. So there you go. That's my update on Tunisia. Moving on from there, I'll just quickly reference that there was on June 9th, so today's June 7th, apparently it is the 50th anniversary of the petrodollar. 50 years ago today was when there was a secret agreement allegedly done between, at the time secret, it has since leaked, between Kissinger and Nixon and the Saudi king to promise to recycle dollars, in the dollars that they earn from selling oil, back into US treasuries, and to keep the status quo of the markets in balance. And this was supposedly struck 50 years ago. It has helped to empower the dollar and make the dollar the go-to global reserve currency. And there is some speculation that it may have had a 50-year cutoff. But nobody knows for sure. So whether or not...
What would that mean?
Well, the question then is, would the Saudis renew the deal, or would they be looking to strike a new deal? And everybody would say that would be with China. But really, their overall... Brad Setzer at CFR did a little thing about it. He doesn't think there's any evidence for a 50-year deal. In fact, he said, let me find it. Hang on, I am so IT challenged. He highlighted that the Saudis clearly haven't been buying fixed income securities of any kind, including US treasuries, out of their oil surplus over the last 10 years. So really, it might just be a moot point, because they might have already, there was, even if it was in play, it doesn't look like, it looks like it was more of a gentleman's agreement anyway. What is interesting is that the Chinese are about to issue their first long-dated bonds next week, I believe, 50-year bonds. Is that to coincide with the, with the new?
That is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that is interesting, like in the sense that it could be the new 50-year deal just by nature of there being 50-year Chinese debt to finally invest in, because again, like investing in the yuan can only go so far if there's no debt, bless you, if there is no corresponding debt to invest in. But the fact that suddenly there's going to be, let me just check how much Chinese long debt, let's do a fact check, long bonds. First batch of, so the first batch of China's 1 trillion yuan, so 140 billion worth of ultra long-term treasury bonds. Have I got the right story? Hang on. China fires starting gun. This is the FT on 140 billion debt sale to boost economy. Yep. So it's coming. 140 billion. That's not to be sniffed at.
No.
So there you go. So what's next on our list? I've mentioned, I guess whilst we're at it, I'll just say that reform, obviously here in the UK, we're going to have elections on July 4th. The Tories are doing absolutely abysmally. I mean, it's not surprising, really.
No.
They've let absolutely everybody down. What's the perception of the Tories from your vantage point in the continent?
Well, from the vantage point of the right-wing magazines that, I try to read a broad spectrum here in Spain, Rishi Sunak was really well regarded just because he's a technocrat, good economic management and all of that. They completely missed the mood in the United Kingdom and in the Tory party, and did not see. And so the inevitable defeat of Rishi Sunak was seen as a bit of a surprise and taken as a bit of a surprise by the middle upper classes here, which they shouldn't be if they had actually had competent news media. Because why the fuck would why would a technocrat ever be popular? Sorry, it just really annoys me.
Well, Farage, it was speculated for a long time that he might come back. He'd always said he wasn't, that he was focused on his GB News presenting career. But he has obviously sniffed out an opportunity. He says he seems to think there's been some sort of popular shift, and thinks that reform could take a hefty chunk out of the Tory, electorate, in the sense that they're obviously not going to win, but the Tories definitely not, and there's no chance, I think, of reform winning. But there's they haven't even had proper seats for this. Just getting seats for them is a big deal.
Yeah.
But the real issue is whether they can be a force to be reckoned with in the opposition. And I think that's where it comes in, because this is the fragmentation of the Tory party, and reform in some respects is the new kind of conservative end of the Tory, like the proper conservative, non-technocratic end of the Tory party. And you've seen defections from the Tories to reform. And by all means, not an expert in this, but it seems significant. And I do think the markets are now overly confident that Labour's going to just swing it with a massive majority. I think Labour will definitely win. I don't know if it will win in a compelling way. I think wait and see what happens with reform, because the so-called red wall, the people who defected from Labour and went to the Tories, they're hugely disappointed. But are they ready to go back to an effective technocratic Labour Party?
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I'm actually not so sure. I wouldn't rule out a hung parliament. I mean, that is definitely not what any political expert is saying. I'm incredibly fringe in that view. The absolute consensus is that Labour will swing to a huge majority, but this is the Blind Spot podcast for a reason.
Yeah, and I would also add on the absolute bungling in terms of how much current Labour leadership has bungled the love from young Labour members Labour members who are in their overwhelming majority are young and care about Gaza and the Palestinian cause, and how roundly, terribly Keir Starmer's team has been handling that. There is absolutely no energy going into Labour, unlike with Jeremy Corbyn or even Ed Miliband. There was more fervor than for this grey suited and booted technocrat that's just going to continue to yeah.
I mean, this is the thing. Perhaps a good moment to sum up your comment last week on the state of exception.
Yes. So this was related to Putin, who said in his, I don't know if you have you seen House of Cards, Izzy?
Yes.
Okay, so the character that plays Putin, Vladimir Petrov, I always thought he was spot on, right?
To be honest, I have seen it. I can't visualize the actor who plays Putin, but
just a total prick. Just a very twisty, wordy, very snaky, slithery character. Putin really personified the inspiration for this character in what he said recently, where he was like, because the Ukrainians haven't had elections yet, we don't know if this is the legally valid government of Ukraine, so we won't be able to do a peace with them. But that brought into question this idea of the state of exception, because obviously Ukraine hasn't had elections because it is in a state of war. And my point was, ironically, that Putin, I mean, it's not a counterpoint to Putin. We all know what game he's playing, but it's the fact that under a state of war is the best time to have a state of exception, because war is in itself exceptional. And so that an exceptional legal state under war is naturally understood by the citizenry. And this gives the legitimacy for these changes to be rolled back. Unlike in every other time that there has been, or most other times that there has been a state of exception in Western countries. An example of this is when I was in France recently, the Crocus City Hall attack in Moscow a few months back by ISIS led France to put in their own, they have this system of alerts, this Vigipirate alert, which effectively suspends basic human rights in France by allowing French police to search absolutely everyone with no cause, which just coincidentally dovetails with these exceptional measures being brought in for the Paris Olympics. And that allows them to put up AI cameras. They force Parisians to carry QR codes with their identities on them, basically like COVID again. And there will be, this is not reported on, but every time you're in Paris, you know that the banlieues, so the suburbs in Paris, which are overwhelmingly black, poor, Muslim, whatever, they have technical faults and they can no longer transit to the center of Paris, coincidentally, whenever these things happen. But this brings us
just like when coincidentally there's a tech outage whenever there's a crypto collapse on the platform. Exactly. Sorry, maintenance right now. Exactly. You can't access your crypto funds. Yeah.
And so this dovetails into the idea that in Western countries, Carl Schmitt, which was this Nazi jurist, talked about how there is no such thing as a liberal democracy. There's just dictatorships in waiting, because whatever body has the ability to call the state that you're in exceptional has the ability to put in exceptional laws that overturn the standard legal framework of the state, has the actual dictatorial power in the state. And so we see this over and over again when our Western states put in and subvert our very basic human rights over what are ultimately extremely minor acts of terrorism where a few dozen people die. And, it's completely subverting the ordinary operations of legality. And so this has just been an ongoing process that has been going on for half a century now. And it's absolutely dreadful. And I just find it ironic. I found it ironic that Putin would highlight the one instance in which the state of exception is not just legitimate, but that's why it's there. It's for the state of war. And it's the one time in which the reforms can actually be rolled back. So that was my piece.
Interesting. Do you think the state of exception applies to America in any shape or form at the moment?
I mean, I think America has been under a state of exception since the Patriot Act, quite clearly, and their ability to basically, I mean, the 9/11 is obviously an exception in this regard because it was genuinely atrocious, but their ability to completely suspend any kind of laws that they have, that American citizens have, as long as you're a terrorist, which became clear when the Obama administration started drone striking American citizens without due process. We've always been fine with that because it's only for terrorists, until, of course, as we saw with COVID and police raids, for example, in Germany against people who were skeptical of the official narratives. Protesting your state is being increasingly synonymous with terrorism. And so the conversation of the Patriot Act that was started by what at the time seemed to be radicals is coming more and more to the light of day. That, legality's gone.
Speaking of state of exception, worth pointing out that Fauci was facing lawmakers this week, finally presenting. I mean, he was being questioned, obviously, about all sorts of protocols that came out during the COVID pandemic. I didn't manage to watch the whole thing, but I watched about half of it, and it had been billed ahead of time as sort of Fauci admits that he made up the 6 feet distancing rules and things like that. What I found really interesting, which I don't think comes across in any of the write-ups of these things, is how the lawmakers questioning him, and I can't remember their names, how obviously partisan they are, in the sense that, and I found this quite surprising because I'd read somewhere that like the committee that is running these inquiries into Wuhan and Lab Leak, I'd read that they were seen as one of the more bipartisan committees, and that they were actually one of the few areas that the Democrats and Republicans were beginning to kind of see a common common purpose in terms of bringing these individuals to account. And yeah, I was quite surprised to see that actually there was continued polarization in the cross-examination of Fauci. I mean, at the extremes, there was like this very apologetic lawmaker going, "Oh, we're so sorry to like embarrass you and have you come in here, and like how embarrassing that you have to be quiet, and you saved so many lives, and I can only apologize for all these like awful, other people who are, asking these terrible questions. We wouldn't want to like, inconvenience you." And then on the other extreme end, you had that Marjorie woman whose name I've forgotten.
Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Yeah, her.
Yeah,
And
that is the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah, and but her cross-examination was equally appalling. I mean, it was ridiculous. She was just holding up these cards of stories that were published in the Daily Mail just like moments before, which obviously were headline driven. And when you actually read when you read the text, you realized that the headline was completely misleading. And it wasn't a cross-examination. It was just a platforming of her views and a one-sided attack on him without any. I mean, it doesn't do either. Like both ends are ridiculous, and they don't bring us any closer to the truth of what happened. And Fauci, obviously, the truth seems to be somewhere like with the 6 feet distancing, for example, was that it wasn't entirely made up. It was like it came out of somewhere, and somebody proposed it, and there wasn't necessarily any like supporting research, but it wasn't like, these things were being experimented with because there wasn't any kind of example to look to where a similar thing had happened. So I was not necessarily myself in support of that, but I do think the questioning was ridiculous, and how much time it wastes. Like, why can't we just have better questioning? And the thing that really bugged me about it was that he was denying a lot of the accusations, which was, not surprising. And I think he was gaslighting a little bit. And especially when they were asking him about whether he had been in touch with the intelligence services at any point, right? And he was saying, "Oh, maybe like back in the day, I've been in touch with them during the anthrax attacks post 9/11, but not really since then." And then on another question, he said, "Oh, yeah, maybe a few questions." When when I've seen with my own eyes, I've seen the correspondence for so-called Red Dawn emails that went round. They were released through a FOIA, and every single one of them, like all those guys are copied in, Farrar and Fauci, and there's like a whole plethora of people from the intelligence services and the military also copied in. So the idea he wasn't in touch with them is, I just think, demonstrably not true.
Yeah.
Now he obviously is in a position where he probably can't talk about it, so it's awkward. But anyway, the whole thing is a bit of a circus at this point. I don't think we're any closer to the truth. But
It'll
let's
take
move
us
on.
a decade probably,
Yes.
or more, and then it'll just come out as obvious all along.
So the last thing we did really was the Europe's shift to the right, because we're running out of time soon. So you looked into the new Dutch PM. Tell us about that.
Yeah.
Speaking
So
of intelligence services.
yeah. So yeah, crazy. Dick Schoof.
What a name.
So, what a name, right? Dick Schoof. It's one of the things that I pointed out was that unlike all of these other leaders with suspect backgrounds, this guy just was the head of the spies. So, there's no dodginess about him. It's just he just was head dodge. So he's a career bureaucrat. Started out as a parliamentary assistant, and I believe, and then just went up all the way to the top of the bureaucratic ladder. Even though Geert Wilders, the winner of the elections, head of the PVV, also
for those who don't know, for our listeners who don't know, Geert Wilders is one of the crazy hair, aspiring to be a bit like Boris Johnson, I think.
Exactly. With a slightly orange tint to his hair, so it's like a bit between the Trump and the Boris.
Yeah, it's almost like a melange. Yes, I like that.
So his first pick was more of a populist, non-bureaucrat guy, but he backed out. But more importantly, what this really brings into question, in my opinion, is how there are two really, really diametrically opposed forces in the new right that we have not seen a showdown of yet, but which are completely opposed and nobody really seems to be talking about, which is the fact that there's one aspect, which is, I'd say, the real driver of its popularity and at least of its ethics and values, which is it's a sector that fights against restrictions to speech, restrictions to legal rights, restrictions in truth, the favorization of race, the favorization of wokeism and of sensibility over facts. And this is, I think, we could call this the good side, the liberal side, the nice side of the right. But then on the other hand, sitting often in the same personalities that are talking about this first thing is a side that's incredibly insecure, incredibly nationalistic, incredibly racist in its own way, obsessed with the great replacement of white people in Europe and things like this, and with the complete knee-jerk reaction to fervent nationalism, state surveillance, and state control over the population. And these two things that really reside in very similar people. Like one of my examples is Ben Shapiro, who, while he claims to be so in favor of freedom of expression and against wokeism and racial ideology, is very happy to slip into a racialist accusatory mood when faced with criticisms of Israel. It's not a comment on Israel in any way, but it's just this idea that the right is really split into two different personalities, and it's a bit schizophrenic at the moment because it cannot face up to the consequences of its own actions. This is very clear with Eva Vlanderberg, who said that Dick Schoof's appointment is a classic move from the deep state, when a month earlier she was not jumping with joy, but very happy with the election of Geert Wilders. And it's like, how could you be surprised that a lifelong bureaucrat opts for another lifelong bureaucrat? And do you think it would have been any different had there been another bureaucrat or another politician put in place to head the Netherlands? Is there really space to change to get this nice liberal side that we're talking about freedom and freedom of speech and legality? Can that even happen? So that was
a really interesting point. And I think that schism, I think that is exactly right. I think the right is very confused at the moment, and there is this kind of natural opposition between those who want to be pro, I would say, like maybe the libertarian end of it, versus the more kind of control pro NATO. We must clamp down on everybody. I agree. So time to bill our newsletter this week. Given we've just been moaning about liberal democracy a little bit, well, not really, but you know what I mean. Do you want to bill your China piece?
Yes. So I'm going to be looking at information that you provided.
Because it was the anniversary of Tank Man,
Square.
Tiananmen Square, yes.
Yeah. And so apparently, and I really wasn't aware until you told me, Izzy, there's a really big debate about whether Tiananmen was as they said it was, which I will be evaluating. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a little change to the official narrative, at least in the West. But this leads into a much more interesting, or not more interesting, but another very interesting point of view, which is a Scotch Ball's theory on revolutions and why a revolutionary country is usually so much stronger than its pre-revolutionary self, to argue that the Chinese Communist Republic is the West's best friend. And the last thing we need is a Chinese democracy.
On the grounds that a Chinese democracy would be utterly destabilized. And what's the logic?
The other way around, so that a Chinese democracy would be much more self-assured, much more confident, much less fearful of internal strife, because that internal strife would be included into its stable, state framework.
Oh, I see. So it's more like so if you're going to be facing an enemy, better to have one with a central point of weakness, like when we think of alien attack films, where as long as you get the mothership, the whole thing collapses.
Yeah,
So
yeah, exactly.
So if we're facing China as an enemy, better that they're a totalitarian mechanism where you just can behead the top of the pyramid and then the whole thing collapses, than a democracy where arguably it's far more, it's far more resilient in some ways to
it's extremely resilient. Yeah.
Unless it's Russia, but that's different because that's technically a democracy. But yeah, interesting. So I just thought I'd also float that we have a new spotlight I did very quickly this week. Let me see, where did I put it? Why don't you ask me about that?
So that was a really interesting post you did. That was a really interesting post you did, and the mystery that I want to ask, there was these really interesting comments about a truth sandwich and pre-bunking. What is a truth sandwich and what is pre-bunking? And could you explain what the chat was supposed to be targeting?
So as faithful loyal readers will know, I have two hats, and what I will say is, in the process of conducting business under my other hat, I had a very interesting experience with some sort of sessions on how to deal with the outbreak and contagion of disinformation ahead of elections this year. And there are groups who are helping journalists understand and identify disinformation and how to recognize it and how to challenge it. And what I would say is there's obviously been a massive realization since, say, 2020, 2021, 22, the QAnon. I think QAnon was like the peak disinformation, hysteria of the last 4 years. And I think the media reacted very kind of stupidly in some ways, because they immediately went after the victims of the disinformation and belittled them and highlighted that they are idiots, and you idiots, why do you believe this? And this is obviously the worst way you can unpack disinformation, because you immediately put people on the defensive, and you're part of the conspiracy, and you're gonna just, I guess, escalate things further. You're gonna lean into the depolarization instead of bringing people together. And it reminds me actually of a session I did with the head of comms for the Vatican back in 2016 at Web Summit. And he was sort of saying to us that in the church, they've known for years, that generations, decades, centuries, that, when they were missionaries, you don't go to those that you're trying to convert by telling them they're idiots and that everything they believe in is like ridiculous and right. You actually have to find common ground with them, and you have to show empathy, and you have to show compassion, and find ways for them to respect you, and only through respect will you finally be able to convert them. It's a real mission for hearts and minds, and I think this is the realization that the kind of fact-checking police of, or the disinfo monitoring groups have finally realized. So the advice is now very different. It is focused on like showing compassion and empathy in your writing and going after the source rather than the victim, and being more aware of how you are inevitably platforming certain disinfo as well. So if there's a fringe theory, if it's coming from like a very small pocket of Gab or something, sometimes better ignore it than to then profile it and platform it on a bigger platform. That was one piece of advice. And the other bit of advice, which I thought was quite interesting, was this truth sandwich thing, which sounds like a PSYOP concept, and it is a PSYOP concept. Yeah. And the idea is that obviously you don't want to inadvertently give credence to anything. So if you are trying to debunk a bit of disinformation, you should essentially upend the normal practice of journalism and lead with the opposite of the story, like sort of like why, you essentially have to disclaim that what you're about to say is going to be not true, and package it with truth, and then present the thing that is wrong, and then once again seal it with a reminder about what the truth is, just in case you led with the absurd. So for example, if the disinformation is most politicians are pedophiles, you would have to structure the story not like most, there's this rabid group of people who believe that politicians are pedophiles and here's why not, blah blah blah. You have to start with, there's definitely politicians of good standing are finding themselves accused of absurd things. One of the bits of disinformation is blah blah blah, and then the other part of that is headlines. And headlines, usually there's always a norm in journalism that you lead with the most unique aspect of a bit of news. So it's either the uniqueness, the variance, or the the sensational bit that you lead with, whereas the advice now is to lead with reestablishing norms. So I found that very interesting. And then finally, the advice is to go like really big on pre-bunking. So before anything even emerges as disinformation, you have to kind of envisage and look for areas that might become disinformation, and then work in advance to pre-bunk them. So you're effectively trying to precondition people not even consider that this bit of disinformation is viable. So all in all, an interesting turn, I would say, especially the focus on empathy and compassion, I think. Go on.
If there's one thing that if there's one thing that the official news media can definitely do to improve their standing against these, one way or another, they are extremes, is the use of empathy and compassion rather than looking down the arrogance with which these fact-checking articles are usually written, or just standard mainstream journalism pieces are usually written with. If they can do away with that, that's 70% of their battle is already won. But I would be very surprised if that happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is something knee-jerk in the DNA of journalists to want to just be quite reactionary and a bit arrogant. So it would... But I actually think it's quite good advice. I think generally speaking, you are going to be more effective if you do that. Yeah. Speaking of disinformation, just very quick flagging that there was this interesting story about the Epoch Times. Speaking of disinformation, Epoch Times has been accused of being a disinformation source for a very long time. I actually started one of my first newsletters on Blind Spot. I was flagging them as an organization and how mysterious they are and who are they really. They're obviously associated with Falun Gong which is an anti-communist dissident group in China, but their funding and their ownership structure is very mysterious. And now it's been outed that the CFO was also supposedly raising money, like, so that he's now being charged with running some sort of scam to raise money for Epoch Times involving cryptocurrency and essentially mechanisms to money launder illicit funds to help boost the company, which I felt was very interesting and very dark ops. Obviously, if you are going to be operating a cutout, you need a source of funding outside of the official, like it's very interesting. We were looking at that. And then last and not least, I just thought it was quite interesting that Jensen Huang, who is the CEO of NVIDIA, how there is a massive disparity. But well, no, disparity is the wrong word. Maybe like there is a massive divide between those who know who he is and those who don't. And I found it quite interesting that most of my colleagues and family have no idea who he is. Yet his keynote, which he did in March, has now accumulated over 27 million views. When you think of those numbers, they're huge numbers.
Yeah.
And this week he was going viral because some woman was asking him to sign his bra, her bra, not his bra. He does not have a bra. And so he's this like new Steve Jobs character, and you either know about him or you don't. And it reminds me very much of Elon Musk in the early days, because there was a time when I remember like getting very excited about who Elon Musk was, not necessarily because I approved or not. I just thought he was an interesting guy that would become a big name. And so many people who, again, the bubble, he was not in their bubble at all. And then suddenly he comes out of nowhere. And I feel like Jensen Huang is about to go mainstream in a really big way and become the sort of household name that Elon Musk is. And last but not least, Roaring Kitty, what's happening with him?
Roaring Kitty, as we know this week, posted evidence that he had never sold his GameStop shares, which those of us who'd been following the story for a while and had heard of Roaring Kitty's reputation, didn't necessarily come as a surprise. But what's more interesting is that, let me just check the absolute latest figures, is that in the last 24 hours, the stock has rallied 50%. But ironically, remember when I said that it was up 20% in pre-market?
Yeah.
At the start, like an hour ago, now it's down 8% in pre-market.
Oh, very volatile. Sounds very volatile. Well, all of that to come. So if you want to see our like very considered thoughts as opposed to these very ad hoc experimental thoughts in this experimental format that we're doing right now, do check in on the newsletter, which is at the-blindspot.com, and give us feedback. Was this a useful session? Was it not? Should we just stop? Should we just, never attempt to be on the internet again? We're happy to hear everything, but be kind, because we're sensitive as well. And we're putting this out on live today. The last one we did, experiment number 1, we put out as a pre-record. Tell us what is better, because we're not sure. And if the other, what else would we want to know? We want to know if we probably do need a jingle. We probably need like any tips, basically help us make this better. If you have any ideas, let us know. And we're also going to put it out on my Blind Spot podcast as an actual podcast without the video. So there you go. That's it. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.